I'm very thrilled to welcome to VCU and the HRC Professor Kirsten Ostherr, the Gladys Louise Fox Professor of English and the Director of the Medical Humanities Program at Rice University in Houston, Texas, where she also chaired the Department of English. And as of last month, she has started a new project, a very exciting project, directing a research institute in medical humanities that she designed and got funding for, which is really exciting. Kirsten received her PhD in American Civilization from Brown University and her MPH, Master of Public Health, right, from the University of Texas Health Science Center in Houston. Dr. Ostherr is a media scholar, health researcher, and technology analyst, and the founder of the Medical Humanities Program and the Medical Futures Lab at Rice University. She has extensive experience using human-centered design as a technique for patient collaboration in health technology development. She co-created Medicine in the Digital Age on EDX, an open online course that has reached over 25,000 global learners. She's the author of 2 books, Medical Visions, Producing the Patient Through Film, Television, and Imaging Technologies, published by Oxford in 2013, and Cinematic Prophylaxis, Globalization and the Contagion in the Discourse of World Health in 2005 by Duke University. She's co-editor of a 2-part special issue of Reviews in Digital Humanities called Race, Health, and Medicine, the editor of Applied Media Studies, 2018, and co-editor of Science/Animation, a special issue of the journal Discourse in 2016. She's now at work on 2 books, as we learned at lunch. The Visual History of Computational Health is the first one, and Virtual Health, the second one, and was just awarded an NEH grant, pretty important, pretty significant, to explore computational health through a humanities lens. Congratulations. Dr. Ostherr's research on trust and privacy in digital health ecosystems has been featured in Marketplace Tech on NPR, The Atlantic, Stat, Slate, The Washington Post, Big Data and Society, Catalyst, and the Journal of Medical Humanities. Her writing about the COVID-19 pandemic has been featured in The Washington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and American Literature. We just had a Meet VCU Authors webinar on Monday on a special issue of American Literature on AI, a field information, and this talk could not have been timelier. Dr. Ostherr is currently leading a digital health humanities project called Transnational Humanities for Public Health that identifies humanities-based pandemic responses from around the world to document and help others build on these creative efforts. If you haven't heard her speak yet, I know Dr. Anderson was referencing her TED Talk earlier today, but if you haven't heard her yet, you're in for quite a treat. And those of you who are not here, I'm sorry for you. She has spoken to audiences at the White House, the Department of Health and Human Services, the World Health Organization, the National Library of Medicine, TEDx, the mHealth Summit, Medicine X, and universities and conferences worldwide. I will not read the title, which you can read by yourselves, but please help me welcome Dr. Ostherr properly to VCU. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. And thank you all for coming out. Let's see. Can you hear me okay? Up in the back? Can you hear me in the back? Yep. Okay, great. Okay, so I want to say also a thank you to Christina Stanchu and Rani Sisavath for inviting me here and for your generous help in getting everything arranged and welcoming me today. And I'm really honored to be here as part of your Health Humanities lab work. It seems, and from what I saw today, you're doing incredible work here and it's inspiring. So I'm happy to be part of this. Okay, so I am going to talk to you today about artificial intelligence and health humanities, a critical nexus for race, data, and clinical algorithms. Here is the outline of my talk. First, I want to touch on ChatGPT because everyone's talking about it, and so I feel like we need to place it in the context of this discussion. Then I'm going to talk a bit about regulatory environments, which is also, I think, a really important context for work in this field. Then I want to move into talking about natural language processing and narrative medicine, which is really where I see the health humanities intervention coming in interesting ways. And then we'll move into thinking about race as a contested signifier in clinical algorithms and as a kind of emblematic site for thinking about and understanding why it's really necessary to have people from fields like health humanities engaged in both discussions of, critiques of, but also actually the building or dismantling of clinical algorithms. And then I'll wrap it up. So first to ChatGPT. So I'd like to start by talking briefly about both the real and imagined uses of ChatGPT and other large language models in healthcare, as these examples can help us open up some of the critical intersections of AI and health and health humanities that I want to discuss with you today. And I'd like to start by explaining the title of this section by noting that ChatGPT is often conflated with AI of late. But in fact, large language models are only one type of AI. They're the most public facing, and that's important because, among other things, that is because they have the lowest barrier to entry. Any one of us could go online and use one right now and devise some purpose for it and then start using it. So there's a very low barrier to entry, but this is by no means the only type of AI. Most other types of AI, however, are much more difficult to use, and probably not that many of us in here could just go ahead and start, create one and start doing something with it, unless you're computer scientists. So ChatGPT, though, I think offers us a way into thinking about sites of health humanities intervention because it centers on language, not quantitative data, even though, of course, there's a lot of data behind it. And making sense of words in context is something that people in the humanities are pretty good at. So you may have seen this piece from June of this year in the New York Times about doctors trying to use ChatGPT to help them handle difficult conversations or to help them come across as more empathetic in situations where they were not sure how to handle awkward interactions. This is one example among many of general purpose large language models being used in a kind of ad hoc way in healthcare already, despite being plagued with hallucinations, misinformation, and discriminatory language. An important development has been the custom creation of large language models for medicine. So companies like Google have taken their baseline large language model, BARD, and then custom fit a medical chatbot on top of it, where they're essentially feeding it tailorized data that is specific to medicine. So in March 2023, the Google's MedPalm 2, it's called, their medical chatbot, tested on the US medical licensing examination, well, on questions very much like the questions on that exam, and performed at an expert level, getting an 85% on the test. And at that time, the Wall Street Journal also reported that a limited number of customers, these being health systems, have been testing MedPalm 2 since around April, including both the for-profit hospital giant HCA Healthcare, but other academic medical centers like the Mayo Clinic. They've been testing these specifically designed large language models to see how they might use them in their own hospitals. But the activities that are happening at these places are not, they're sort of lightly publicized, but not widely publicized or in a great deal of detail because they're still trying to figure out what's happening. And meanwhile, they're working out the problems. So these pilot tests have used MedPalm to help doctors and nurses with things like knowledge retrieval, clinical decision support, summarizing findings, triaging patients, and addressing primary health concerns. And as part of this whole rollout, Google has also been working with a health tech company called Augmetics to create what they call an ambient listening system. You may have heard of this idea that is meant to automatically transcribe doctor-patient conversations and they're testing it right now in the emergency room, but the goal is to have it used in potentially any situation. So right now, HCA, this for-profit health system, is testing this ambient listening system with about 75 doctors in 4 hospitals. And they plan to expand to more hospitals later this year as the automation improves. Yet, even while all of this is happening and these tools are being used, Google admitted in a published research article in May of 2023 that even with large language models that are specifically trained on medical data, these models may produce text generations that are, as they said, misaligned with clinical and societal values. They may, for instance, hallucinate convincing medical misinformation, or incorporate biases that could exacerbate health disparities. So I want to emphasize the fact that these tools are being used right now in patient care, and these results are happening. So adoption forges ahead. Augmetics plans to collaborate with HCA Healthcare to develop this ambient documentation product for acute care clinicians, and building on the emergency department, and to move it into lots of other departments as well. And what they're trying to do is convert what they call natural clinician-patient conversations into medical notes that physicians and nurses can then review in the electronic health record system. But it's worth noting, and we'll come back to this a bit, that this is really an AI plus human solution, or it's a human in the loop solution, as is often called, because as the company's own promotional materials state, to ensure the highest quality experience, we include a trained medical documentation specialist for your whole shift. That is the shift of the doctor who's testing out this technology right now. Each specialist is a member of your care team communicating with you in real time through two-way messaging. So this is a human in the loop model. And, just as sort of a side note, but an important one, that means that this is actually more expensive than what is done without AI, because it's the technology plus an extra person. And that's, I think, an interesting element to come back to here. Okay, so large language models like ChatGPT are already being used in healthcare. And I want to take a few moments to discuss what kinds of regulations govern their use. So first, just generally AI regulation. And some of you may be keeping up with this, so I apologize if this is repetitive for you, but in case not everyone is. In June of this year, the European Parliament passed a draft law known as the AI Act, which would put new restrictions on what are seen as the technology's riskiest uses. This isn't, the final law hasn't been passed yet, so they're expected to vote on it sometime this fall. But it's in motion, it's working its way through the government approval system. So the idea is that this law would severely curtail uses of facial recognition software, and also require makers of AI systems like ChatGPT to disclose more about the data used to create their programs, and potentially to even require them to show the source for every single piece of data that they have scraped to train the model, which would essentially make it impossible for them to continue operating as a company. So that is a pretty restrictive model that is out there as compared to the other ones that are currently under consideration. In the United States, the White House released policy ideas. So again, it's not a law, but it's guidelines in a document they titled Blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. That include ideas for testing AI systems before they're publicly available, and that really foregrounds protecting privacy rights, civil rights, and democratic values. And I have a picture of Dr. Alondra Nelson up there because she was heading up the Office of Science and Technology Policy when this blueprint was released, and really was one of the main authors and architects of it. And she is a scholar of race and science and technology studies, and an absolute hero of mine. And if you don't know her work, please do yourself a favor and look it up later. She's incredible. She has stepped down from that role and is now at the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. And then in China, this is the last regulatory environment I'll touch on. Draft rules were unveiled in April that would require makers of chatbots to do a few things, including adhering to the country's censorship rules and also party ideology. But they also were expected to avoid publishing any material that critiques leadership, or according to some news reports, that rehashes forbidden history, as they said. In addition, they were supposed to make sure somehow that the words and pictures that chatbots created were truthful and respected intellectual property. Since those draft rules were released in April, a revised version was released in August, which scaled that back some, especially that last part about making sure that they could kind of authenticate the production that chatbots were creating. And they said that only providers who wanted to offer services to the public would have to sort of submit security assessments and documentation, but firms that were working on enterprise-facing products or non-public facing products would not have to. So that's kind of an interesting loophole that we'll have to see how that develops. So, but there's a larger regulatory context that I want to talk about, which is that was all just AI in general, but we're talking about AI for health here. So the healthcare context is really important. And again, probably for some people in the audience, this is quite familiar, and for others, maybe not as much. But the question of what rules govern medical AI, I think, is an important question to ask. And at a very minimal level, the answer is HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996. And I'll explain in just a second why I say at a minimal level. But that law basically established a privacy rule that set national standards for protection of certain kinds of health information. It mandated that the use and disclosure of protected health information by what are called covered entities, mainly doctors, insurance companies, and a few others, are subject to that privacy rule. And then also, HIPAA is supposed to assure that personal protected health information is properly protected while still allowing the flow of health information that's needed to both provide care and protect the public's health. So this is a very high level overview. The HIPAA does other things too, but these are the contours of the law. Importantly, covered entities are really what you would consider as most traditional medical settings. So nothing outside of a hospital, really. I mean, it could be a doctor's office, but let's say you're using a wellness app on your phone. That would not be covered at all. Some ethicists have recently written about HIPAA in relation to chatbots. And of course, all of this is so new. So this was published in July of 2023, just a few months ago. But these two bioethicists looked at ChatGPT in particular in relation to HIPAA and concluded that chatbots cannot comply with HIPAA in any meaningful way, despite industry assurances. And even if they could, it would not matter because HIPAA is outdated and inadequate to address AI-related privacy concerns. They also went on to point out that even if a company or a user did not input personal health information into a chatbot, AI can often infer it from the data that is provided. So in other words, the regulation of AI or say health data in the context of chatbots is essentially non-existent. But there is one other place where there is sort of a regulatory context that I want to touch on, and that's the FDA, the US Food and Drug Administration, which issued regulatory guidance, again, not a law, but guidance, which they released in January of 2021. And that was meant to govern AI and machine learning under the heading of software as a medical device. So FDA reviews other medical devices like like implanted defibrillators or X-ray machines or those sorts of things. And so this is another category of a medical device, is the way that they're framing it. But importantly, the way that they set out this guidance was in relation to locked, not adaptive algorithms. So in other words, the issue of AI evolving and that being kind of one of its primary powers in a way, this guidance can't really deal with that, because if you submit something and it's approved, only that instance is approved as it exists at that moment in time. So, but the FDA does have this website, which is interesting, where it lists the software as a medical device submissions that have been approved, and they've updated it twice. So once in September 2021, once in October of 2022. I expect they'll probably release something this fall as well. And right now there are about 343 entries on that list, including examples that were developed to aid in COVID-19 diagnosis and treatment, and also facilitation of telehealth during the pandemic. But what we have here is a review process that is basically meant to show how this works, but not really control it in any sense. So this is not, it's not a law. There's no accountability. There's no kind of enforcement mechanism. So, but there is one way in which FDA approval is very important, and that is in terms of regulation and reimbursement. So just to kind of get through this sort of policy part, which I think is really important to the context of how we think about this stuff. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, is the single largest payer for healthcare in the United States. CMS approves public insurance reimbursement rates, and in that way either facilitates or inhibits new technology adoption, because CMS approval requires FDA approval. So if any medical AI is hoping to get paid for by insurance, it has to be FDA approved. So that's where kind of this whole system comes together ultimately. You know, what is the marketplace for medical AI is another way of asking this question. Okay. And part of what is very, very important about this whole discussion about regulation and how, you know, whether in this context where so much is at stake, whether we can really understand what is being done with these tools. Researchers have noted that the data sets that are used for these kinds of regulatory clearances at the FDA are often made up of retrospective single institution data that are mostly unpublished and considered proprietary. So no one else can review them and validate them. And to build trust in medical AI systems, stronger standards for reporting transparency and validation will be required, including demonstrations of impact on clinical outcomes. So we're very much at this strange moment where these tools are being used in healthcare. The regulatory environment is very, very loose. And it is itself made up of a lot of secret data, essentially. So that creates a situation where it's hard to put trust in this system, and yet there's a great deal of engagement and momentum to engage with using these systems as we're going forward. So it is a strange moment, and chances are good that if I was giving this talk 6 months from now, there would be a lot of different things that I would be able to say about this, though whether the regulatory part will change is, I think, still to be determined. But the other piece of the kind of the regulatory and approval and use part that I really want to highlight is that on the one hand, you know, as I started this in the first section, we have things like ChatGPT, which are widely discussed and public facing and are producing all of these problems and make it seem like that's what AI is. And then we have the reality of what's happening in actual clinical settings with AI, with other kinds of AI, not large language models. And there what you see is that there are actually very narrow sites of development and application and testing and adoption where a particular model will be developed for a specific purpose, like interpreting mammographies or cardiac function assessments, or lung cancer screenings, or cancer diagnosis, or colonoscopy guidance, or diabetic retinopathy detection, really, really specific, narrowly defined applications where what the people are doing who are creating those AI systems is constructing a data set from scratch that's just for that purpose, training a model just on that data set, refining that so that it is really good at this one super specific thing, and that's it. So think about that in comparison to large language models where it's very general. You can ask ChatGPT anything, right? And it will go off in a bunch of different directions for that. So that's kind of the landscape of medical AI right now, from the ChatGPT end to this end, where it's very, very specific and narrow in terms of the application. Okay, I wanted to mention this to all of you because this is a resource that was just released, I think last week by Stat Plus, which is a media company that focuses on health and technology. It's part of the Boston Globe newspaper group. And so it's a generative AI tracker in healthcare. And it's a fascinating place to look at what different hospitals are doing. And the data set is based on public announcements, postings on websites, and presentations at conferences, other things like that. So it's kind of tracking in real time what's happening. So if this is an area of interest for you, this is a great resource to look at. And the last thing that I really want to say about the regulatory environment is that despite much of this realm being unproven in terms of its benefit and not validated, huge amounts of money are being invested in it. You can see here the US digital health funding and deal size in the world of venture capital from 2012 to 2022. You can see there was a massive spike during the pandemic, which came down a lot. But if you just kind of skim across the overall, the top of this bar graph, what you see is that investment is continuing to go up and in the billions of dollars, right? So it looks like it went way down, but it's more sort of a correction from an unusual high. There's still a lot of investment in this field, though there is, interestingly, this is a graph that I actually just saw today. It was just released, looking at healthcare AI funding and deals. And so this is showing that, deals, acquisitions, I think mainly of startup companies, has so far gone way down in 2023, though we're not at the end of the year yet. So this whole field is moving very quickly, and I think it's going to be very interesting to see how it all ultimately plays out. But we can see that the adoption of AI in healthcare has already really been taken up in a lot of different realms, and I don't expect that to end or go away. Okay, so I think that lays the context for now thinking about natural language processing and narrative medicine. So in addition to these regulatory areas and concerns that they may bring around privacy or liability issues, the application of AI in medicine raises questions of epistemology that I think health humanities researchers are very well positioned to address. Humanities scholars have pointed to the need for interpretive agility, tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, and narrative humility in healthcare in general. And I want to ask how these principles might operate in a healthcare environment that is becoming more and more dominated by data-driven clinical algorithms like AI tools that depend on binary logic and inflexible data labeling. So in this section of the talk, I'm going to look at how text-based AI, like large language models, that functions through natural language processing can open up a space for health humanities to intervene in data-driven logics. And I will argue that we can build on some of the core principles of narrative medicine to do so. So first, what is natural language processing? Google defines natural language processing as, and I'm quoting, using machine learning to reveal the structure and meaning of text, With natural language processing applications, organizations can analyze text and extract information about people's places and events to better understand social media sentiment and customer conversations, end quote. You might wonder why I'm using Google's definition, and it's because this, as they say, the information about people, places, and events, when considered in the healthcare context, becomes quite valuable and also quite sensitive information. Amazon, who similarly is very involved in natural language processing and AI development, urges organizations to, quote, mine their large volumes of voice and text data from various communication channels like emails, text messages, social media news feeds, video, audio, and more, and then use natural language processing software to automatically process that data, analyze the intent or sentiment of the message, and respond in real time to human communication on that basis. Google, Amazon, and all of the other large tech companies believe that these kinds of narrative details, which are often called social determinants of health data in healthcare, contain valuable information about patients' health and illness. And in fact, these companies already have a lot of that kind of data from their users' search or purchasing histories. And they are looking to use those data sets in partnerships with academic medical centers because social determinants of health is seen as a mechanism for cost savings through population health, ideally for better care as well. In different contexts, social determinants of health is actually the site of much anti-racist work in medicine and public health. And I'm interested in exploring this tension and looking for possible methods to benefit disenfranchised patients using natural language processing. So if this term is not familiar to you, the WHO defines social determinants of health as the conditions in which people are born, grow, work, live, and age, and the wider set of forces and systems shaping the conditions of daily life. In many ways, social determinants of health is at the core of medical and health humanities. But healthcare is seen as a huge and largely untapped market for technology companies and AI ventures. And one focus for many of these technology efforts is human communication, not in the form of drop-down menus or quantitative data, both of which are readily machine readable and also limited in their contextual significance, but rather in speech and unstructured notes. So these are the spaces where social determinants of health, or what Google called information about people, places, and events, might appear. But even as big technology companies are eager to mine social sentiment, the state of the research is this. Advances in natural language processing have opened up a wealth of new data sets and AI opportunities, although major limitations still exist due to the difficulty of extracting information from long text sequences. So this is important because actually many analysts attribute the failure of early medical AI efforts like IBM's Watson Health to the insurmountable challenge of unstructured information. And part of the problem was a mismatch between the seeming preponderance of big quantitative data sets in medicine and the reality that healthcare encounters occur not only between machines, but primarily between human beings who produce a lot of unstructured data in our health communications. So while data from lab results and vital sign measurements might be easy enough to feed into algorithms, the potential promise of medical AI has primarily been demonstrated, as I mentioned, in really carefully controlled, narrowly constructed experiments. And so there was this real mismatch. As you see in this quote, this is from a piece that was trying to explain the failure of many early attempts to develop AI tools that would analyze like an entire hospital's electronic health record system, all of the data in it. And they found that some of the data could be easily digested by machines, but that actually there is this estimate circulating out there that about 80% of a typical patient's record is this unstructured information, and which is described here as a stew of jargon, shorthand, and subjective statements. But I would argue that those are precisely the spaces where the context of that patient's life, if it exists at all in their medical record, is most likely to be found. So AI companies claim that they can solve this problem. They claim that they've gotten further with natural language processing. And I just wanted to show you, this is one example of an advertisement from a company. This company's called IQVIA. And this is the claim in a nutshell. Insights are trapped in mountains of text. NLP sets them free. So the use of natural language processing for healthcare is promoted in part as a method for addressing the need to represent patient perspectives in medicine by utilizing computational text mining to better integrate qualitative and quantitative data in patient records. At least this is an ideal that is set forth. Given the subtleties entailed in representing patient narratives through diverse forms of mediation, though, natural language methods would really benefit, I think, from the insights of scholars with expertise in the interpretation of narratives in complex, intersubjective, social, and cultural contexts, especially for marginalized and underrepresented communities. Some clinical researchers have proposed using natural language processing to provide access to patient perspectives by integrating analysis of their clinical records, including unstructured free text, with user-generated content from social media like Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, and Instagram, as well as online health communities. And this is an example of the kinds of personal information, but also you could say social determinants of health that can be scraped from a Facebook breast cancer support group site. And this is important information to the people involved in this group. It's important information for their care, but how it is shared and to what ends is really not presently being controlled by patients. And this is a real question when we think about regulation moving forward and whose voices should be present in discussions of what that should look like. Because this is exactly the kind of data that a lot of people are arguing should be integrated into data sets that also have clinical data in order to train medical general AI. But the people involved in this group have no ability to consent or opt out of that whatsoever. And in fact, I will just mention briefly the sort of most recent concept of where medical AI could go. This is still really hypothetical, is this concept of multimodal biomedical AI, which is sometimes also called general medical AI. And this is a piece from Nature Medicine from about a year ago that sketched out what that might look like. And you can't really, well, maybe you can actually read it. You can kind of see what all the different potential sources of data are, and the idea that they could all be integrated together in order to create a much more multifaceted predictive model for people's healthcare and health outcomes. And this is just a different model of what that might look like in terms of the data sources that would be mined and then funneled into a multimodal AI. And then in this scenario would provide a kind of resource to augment human clinicians who are caring for patients. So I'm not going to go into the details of how all this would work. We could talk about it later if you want, but what I really wanted you to see is that people who are working in this field are imagining a future in which that kind of scraping from all these different sources is combined with, you know, your genome sequence, your EHR data, all this other stuff for the purpose of developing AI for use in healthcare. Okay, so that's, in a sense, the natural language processing context for building on scholarship in narrative medicine that has laid the groundwork for research on narrative and unstructured text in patient records. And there's a clear need for teaching and research on practical and ethical issues in conducting large-scale big data analysis of unstructured text in medicine, especially given all the ethical issues that I've gestured to in terms of where this data is coming from and whether people can opt out at all or are even aware. So this is a field that AI for Health is poised to expand through collaborations between people in different disciplines. And this is a place where I really think that people trained in health humanities who are able to understand and collaborate with people in computer science, data science, and other computational fields could make a real difference and a major intervention. And this again comes back to the idea of social determinants of health. So a major reason that social determinants of health data hold so much appeal for technology companies and health researchers alike is that they provide the fine-grained, nuanced descriptors that give meaning and context to individual lives. Since at least the 1970s, scholars in medical and health humanities have recognized the value of personal narratives as sources of perspectives on patients' lives. And they've published accounts of the value of listening to, reading, and writing illness narratives. In their piece called Abolition Medicine, Yoshiko Iwai and colleagues focused on language and erasure in this context. They note that at the same time that trauma calls forth a need for narration, patient voices are erased. Black and other minoritized voices are excluded, and those stories that do remain are reduced to the abbreviated phrases and generic drop-down menu selections typical of contemporary electronic health records. Part of what companies like Google and Amazon bring to this conversation is a set of ideas and practices about how data and narratives from outside of clinical contexts could help contextualize and interpret clinical signals. However, these companies have also brought continued exploitation of patient narratives, and they've been sued for privacy violations for doing so. So to be clear, I'm not proposing an embrace of big tech here, but I think it's worth thinking through what their methods might reveal about alternative approaches for researchers and clinicians to pursue equitable, anti-racist, and patient-centered narrative medicine. Because if we want to use humanities methods to challenge computational logics in healthcare, we must reckon with the ways that these companies operate, which is by engaging users to capture our narratives and experiences and then turn them into data sets. And indeed, the investigative journalism group, The Markup, showed in June 2022 how Facebook is doing this by installing a tracking tool on many hospitals' websites that's been collecting patient-sensitive health information, including details about their medical conditions, prescriptions, and doctor's appointments, and sending it to Facebook. The Markup found that 33 of Newsweek's top 100 hospitals in the country were sending sensitive data to Facebook through this pixel. So users engage on Facebook to share their personal stories with friends, and then the Facebook pixel follows them to hospital websites and wherever they may go from there, and they're just collecting data the whole way. So, you can see there are many cautions and worries about AI in healthcare and the use of natural language processing. But I want to wrap up this section with a more positive spin on natural language processing for patient narratives, which I have found generative for a number of years now, and I think you might too. So in one study using natural language processing, researchers use this technology to mine text and conduct sentiment analysis on a Yelp data set of over 16,000 reviews of US hospitals. What the researchers found was that the majority of reviews expressed patient and caregiver experiences that were not identified by HCAHPS, which is the name of the survey that is used nationwide that is sent to every patient after their discharge from the hospital. You may have received it yourself if you've been hospitalized recently. So none of the topics that patients focused on in these reviews were covered by HCAHPS domains, suggesting that Yelp, these reviews on Yelp, provided a window into what mattered most to those reviewers in their own words. And so this really makes me question, is this a form of big data driven narrative medicine? What they're essentially saying, they're not arguing that therefore Yelp is a great source for doctor reviews or hospital reviews, to be clear. But what they're saying is we can see here people talking about what matters most to them, and that is not captured in these other approaches to assessing patient satisfaction. So there's an interesting window there that is enabled by natural language processing. So I think by offering a counterpoint to surveys of patient satisfaction that only measure what hospitals care about, not what patients care about, I would argue that Reina Merchant's Yelp research team embraced what Sayantani Dasgupta calls narrative humility in a piece from 2008 in the Lancet. Dasgupta uses this term to address the potentially colonizing effects of an approach to narrative medicine that would have physicians setting the terms of interpretation and making all the decisions about what parts of a patient's story are important. We can also consider narrative humility as a form of guidance for looking at medical narratives as they are constructed in EHRs, whose data are used to train AI systems. So the question is, who decides what part of the narrative to capture in the ER, which then trains the AI model, and what gets left out? So I think this concept is something that if we could bring it into the context of discussions about AI development and classification and labeling, we might end up with some very interesting results. Okay, so this leads me into the last major section of this talk, race as a contested signifier in clinical algorithms. So the question of whose voices are included is particularly important when it comes to consideration of patients whose voices have been historically silenced and excluded. So I want to turn now to examine the status of race as a contested signifier in medicine, in society, and in clinical algorithms, to map out the ways that critical interventions from the health humanities can advance our understanding of the possibilities and limitations of AI for health. Building on the work of scholars who have examined the concept of race correction in medicine and racial bias in algorithms outside of healthcare, we will consider how to address the intersection of these issues to increase equity and justice in the healthcare system. So stepping back to look at medical AI applications as a whole, we must consider the broader debates about ethical issues in technology systems, which has gotten a lot of attention in the past few years, especially in relation to algorithmic bias. And researchers have called out racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination in tools used for policing, financial systems, employment software, education, and more. So I would like to now consider if and how algorithmic bias also operates in healthcare. And in the opening section, we already talked about discriminatory output in medical applications of large language models like ChatGPT. But I wanted to put up this definition of algorithmic bias in medical AI because when I talk with people who are working in this field, I feel like it's really important to, to be clear about what we mean by these terms, but also to not assume a priori what we're going to find. But in fact, what we have found is racial bias in medical algorithms in a number of examples. This is probably the most famous. This may be familiar to some of you in here. This is an article that Ziad Obermeyer and a team published in Science in 2019. It's been called a landmark publication. And what it did was it basically documented the discriminatory effect of using healthcare spending as a proxy for health status. And what they found was basically that if two people have the same risk score, which is what a lot of clinical algorithms aim to produce, that risk score would indicate that they do not need to be enrolled in a high risk management program. But in those circumstances, the health of the Black patient is likely to be much worse than that of their white counterpart. And they looked at Black and white patients in this study. So, and further, according to Obermeyer and his team, if the predictive tool were recalibrated to actual needs on the basis of the number and severity of active chronic illnesses instead of cost, then twice as many Black patients would be identified for intervention. So in other words, what they had the opportunity to actually examine the algorithm itself and the data that were used, which is rare because so many of these are considered proprietary in the way I was discussing earlier. But in doing that, what they found was that basically by using the amount of money spent on healthcare as a proxy for health, which is very common, that is a common proxy, that what that ended up doing was essentially rewarding people who use the healthcare system more by giving them more resources. And so what that means is that people who have barriers to accessing care or who are told that they're not sick when they're feeling sick spend less on their care. So they end up being interpreted by the algorithm as healthier when in fact it's the opposite. Ruha Benjamin also published a commentary in Science on that piece. And I want to highlight something here about the way that this was presented because it speaks very much to the Health Humanities intervention. So in the Obermeyer piece, in part of their summary, they say, whether it is communication, trust, or bias, something about the interactions of Black patients with the healthcare system itself leads to reduced use of healthcare. The collective effect of these many channels is to lower health spending substantially for Black patients, conditional on need, a finding that has been appreciated for at least 2 decades. This is their summary, which is trying to highlight the consequence of this sort of problems where racism may occur beyond the algorithm. So in communication, trust relationships, or bias, as well as in the algorithm itself. But even this extremely important study overemphasized, I think, the role of the algorithm without looking carefully enough at the narrative context for the data that were being misconstrued. And in Ruha Benjamin's commentary, she zeroed in on that particular section and noted, it's not something about the interactions that Black patients have with the healthcare system that leads to poor care, but the persistence of structural and interpersonal racism. And she goes on to say, importantly, passive and sanitized descriptions continue to hide the very social processes that make Obermeyer's study consequential. Labels matter. So she both praised the valuable work of this team, and it really was a really very important study in terms of, especially to prove to people who were skeptical about whether racism would be found in clinical algorithms, to prove that it was unambiguously in operation. But she also wanted to highlight their handling of the larger historical context in which this kind of discrimination is occurring, specifically in order to say, don't get too hung up on the algorithms alone, because fixing the algorithms, if that is possible, is not going to fix the racist context in which they are operating. And so it's very important to not have too narrow a perspective on what kind of critique needs to be happening here and what kind of intervention is needed. And this point is further emphasized in another piece that wasn't about the Obermeyer study, but that came out not too long after, who point out that patients of lower socioeconomic status are less likely to access healthcare services, and a lack of trust, or more precisely, a lack of trustworthiness on the part of the medical industry, which is a phrase they borrow from an earlier publication, also by Ruha Benjamin, is hypothesized to result in a lack of engagement with healthcare by Black individuals and hence in racial disparities in healthcare spending. So one of the points that they are making in this piece, just to kind of extend the point about the importance of not focusing only on the algorithm, is the point is, if you're not part of the healthcare system, then you're not part of the data set. And even if you are part of the data set, you're likely to be misinterpreted because the historical context that explains the real meaning of your health data cannot be accounted for in the ways that it's being used in the context of classification models for AI. Now, this is, of course, all happening in the context of the ways that people think about race in medicine. And I've been arguing for integration of theories and practices of narrative interpretation into large-scale data analysis for the purpose of pursuing digital health equity. But these narratives must be understood as products of patients and also as products of a medical system that has had many racist encounters with patients throughout its history. And so it may be well known to people in this room that despite extensive scholarship demonstrating the lack of a biological or genomic basis for race, and despite ongoing evidence of the severe harms caused by the perpetration of racist ideas in medicine, that nonetheless, in medical training and clinical practice to this day, race is considered as a factor in both implicit and explicit ways all the time. In fact, the first line of a 2020 article in the New England Journal of Medicine describing the ongoing use of so-called race correction algorithms in medicine was this: physicians still lack consensus on the meaning of race. The authors go on to explain, one subtle insertion of race into medicine involves diagnostic algorithms and practice guidelines that adjust or correct their outputs on the basis of a patient's race or ethnicity. Physicians use these algorithms to individualize risk assessment and guide clinical decisions. By embedding race into the basic data and decisions of healthcare, these algorithms propagate race-based medicine, and many of these race-adjusted algorithms guide decisions in ways that may direct more attention or resources to white patients than to members of racial and ethnic minorities, much like the findings of the Obermeyer piece. I'll just show you, not to read all of this, but just these are, this is a table from the article showing just how many examples of this so-called race correction they were able to find in their research in a wide variety of medical fields. And it's important to note that, as I mentioned earlier, many of the tools that are digitizing these clinical algorithms are being developed and deployed based on proprietary data sets and black box approaches to their algorithms. And so it's very hard to actually test and validate claims of the racist effects of these things. But when we know the larger context in which they're operating, it is a reasonable assumption to conclude that they most likely are having really harmful effects. But it's very difficult to get inside them and actually analyze it and prove it. So practices of data mining and aggregation have really helped create the conditions of possibility and also the market demand for medical predictive analytics and AI to be deployed as risk management tools that end up reproducing existing forms of health disparities. So what we see is that healthcare systems need to analyze huge complex data sets to predict patient health outcomes and population health outcomes. And the logic is that the only way to do this is with machine learning because the data sets are too large for human interpretation. So this is the context in which these kinds of algorithms are being deployed and the logic for continuing to do so. And just as an example from one tool that was rolled out by LexisNexis, this shows you the way that concepts like that are from social determinants of health can be twisted in a way that ends up being harmful to the very people they're supposedly meant to help, where they categorize things like liens, evictions, and felonies that may be in a person's health or in a person's history, in their data history, which ends up, when understood in the context of health, leading their algorithm to the interpretation individual health may not be a priority. And this is another image from those same promotional materials where, for example, low education is equated with smoking and premature death, thus framing those patients as higher and bad risks. And the point that I just want to emphasize here is that there are algorithms that don't seem on their face to be producing racist results, and then there are those that quite obviously are doing so. And focusing on the algorithm alone is important, but as I hope I've shown, it isn't the whole picture. So to move to conclusion here, as I noted earlier in the talk, humanities scholars have pointed to the need for interpretive agility, tolerance for ambiguity and uncertainty, and narrative humility in healthcare. And I also asked, how can these principles operate in an environment dominated by data-driven clinical algorithms that depend on binary logic and inflexible data labeling? I've tried to show today that the field of health humanities can address the intersection of these issues to increase equity and justice in the healthcare system. And while the threats to patient privacy by large tech companies that exploit health-relevant data sets are real, the need for capturing patient voices that have been systematically excluded from those data sets is also real. Racial signifiers pervade the unstructured data and logics of electronic health records and the algorithms that drive them. And these complex data sets are at the center of efforts to develop AI for healthcare. So I hope that this sketch of AI in healthcare that I've presented to you today shows why we need humanities-based understanding of narrative, ethics, and histories of digital inequality to be integrated with computational tools of natural language processing. And I hope that some of the researchers in this room might pursue these kinds of collaborations to bring new perspectives to the real value that may lay within unstructured patient data sets. Thank you.
Have at least 5 or 10 minutes for questions, and I don't think they can hear, but just wave and we'll send the mic to you. Not even sure I need them, right?
So I think it's very, thank you, first of all, for being here and speaking with us. I think that my lens is from government and policy. And the first thing I thought was, well, don't let private companies do it. If you can get someone in the government or at CMS to build the models and to integrate NLP with, I mean, CMS data is a gold mine for that, then maybe it wouldn't be monetized. Maybe you wouldn't have privacy issues. Is that kind of an avenue that is being looked at? Do you know?
I wish I could say yes. Just yesterday, some of you may have heard the heads of like the 20 biggest technology companies were in Washington. I saw one headline that said something like $3 billion worth of tech value were gathered in the same room, you know. And they got a warm welcome, you know, from senators who were meeting with them in a private meeting. I don't see this as viable for a couple of reasons. One, even in academia, it's actually very hard to get people in computer and data science who could also go work for Google or Facebook or Microsoft or Baidu or many of the other big companies. And that's where a lot of them go. And it's even harder to get them to go to government. So the strategy so far has been, at least under Obama and Biden, has been to appoint really smart people who can bridge government and technology, like Alondra Nelson. But they're not developing the tools. I think it would have to be a really different political system. And honestly, there isn't a single one in the world that's taking that approach. I mean, China, you could imagine, might be the most likely in the sense that industry and government are much more tightly connected, but that's not what they're trying to do either. So I don't see that happening. It would be great if it did. I share that view with you because it seems like it would solve a lot of problems, but I don't think that's going to happen. Yeah.
Kirsten, that's a great talk. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
I'm wondering whether the humanities should approach this from a different angle. Instead of trying to correct the algorithms, can the humanities focus on creating synthetic standard data sets that now becomes the benchmark against which these algorithms are tested? It's got the natural distribution of populations, demographics, social determinants of health, and all of that. But that's what we are missing, because any company, if they are hiding their data, well, they'll hide their data. But if we can take that algorithm and test it against our gold data set and see it's not. So we are essentially giving a grade for these algorithms. I'm wondering if there's any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting angle. And in fact, I read, I don't know if you saw, I think it was last week that Time came out with the 100 most influential people in AI. And Ziad Obermeyer, the lead author on that study, was one of them. And I read the piece about him. And it talked about how since that study, he has created this nonprofit that is trying to create better data sets for medical AI developers to use to train algorithms that wouldn't have all these problems in them. I don't know a lot about how far along that is. It must be fairly new, but it's definitely worth looking into. And I don't know if they're doing synthetic data sets or real ones. I could imagine that they might be doing synthetic ones. The one really big challenge there is that how do you define what's representative and accurate in order to make a synthetic model of it? So usually that then leads you back to looking at historical data sets in some way or other. And so you would then have to figure out a way to correct for the history of racism, the history of sexism, the history of all these other discriminatory practices that have completely defined the life experiences and the healthcare encounters of millions of people for so long, and which are built into the standards for what is representative in certain ways, depending on what you're doing. So I'm not saying that's not insurmountable, but that's a big challenge, right? So because what you would really have to create then would be kind of a utopian synthetic database in a way, right? If you were trying to create something that actually didn't have any histories of discrimination built into it. You know what I mean? So I think I hope that work develops in that direction and where people are really scrutinizing those questions. But I think there too, the people, humanists need to be involved for sure, right? And people who can kind of cross these areas. I think we really need more people who can be kind of multilingual in this way, who may be mainly rooted in the humanities, but understand enough about data science, or who may be mainly in data science, but understand enough about humanities, so that they're, willing and motivated to ask these questions in the first place, and then to put the energy into really pursuing how we would approach these different strategies for trying to not reproduce the problems that these data sets are reproducing.
Hi, my name is Lydia. I work in our Office of Research here. So my brain right now looks sort of like that circle with all the intersections that you have out there.
Yeah.
So I'm going to try to narrow my focus to one question. But, when I was listening to your talk, I hear so many points where there are opportunities for us to have, more transdisciplinary teams that really are including the humanities in the work that's happening on our medical campus. But I also was listening as someone who lives with a couple of rare diseases that, in the spirit of capitalism, I've managed to monetize by doing patient surveys and patient interviews and speaking on patient panels to clinical, to pharmaceutical companies and that sort of thing. And what I'm always asked are questions about, why did you use this medicine? Why didn't you use it this way? Would you try this? And if so, why? I come from a poor socioeconomic background, so I have the lens of my mother, who also has been a sort of a victim of the system of like, well, you're not accessing healthcare, so clearly you're not going to comply. When in reality, it's those last couple of slides where she didn't have health insurance, she didn't have these things. So my question to you is there a place where what you've talked about today exists outside of an academic setting? Are there companies that are using this that are good models for incorporating health humanities in AI and health and that sort of thing?
There are definitely So there are definitely patient communities that I know of that are trying to influence companies to do this, and who are looking at sometimes models of owning their own data and monetizing it in this way, like whole data sets, and trying to kind of shift the balance of power in the system in that way a little bit. But I've heard people in a lot of startups express the goal of doing this, of being more kind of patient-centered, and of sort of organizing their business around that. I haven't seen it in practice all that much, or I haven't seen it in practice in a way that is sustainable, or that was sustained all that much. And I think it's possible that the answer would be different in different parts of the world where there's different health policy and different reimbursement models. But the incentive structure in American healthcare is such that people would have to figure out a pretty different model for making money. I mean, in the same way that sort of the whole data mining system has been all about, us being, our data being the thing that we give away for free. The question of how we could incentivize a company to not exploit patient data, essentially, in a way that doesn't, that use it in a way that really helps the patient, not the people who already make the most money in the healthcare system. It would require a different system, I think, in some sense. However, there are ideas out there that kind of, that people have taken up a little bit here and a little bit there. And so part of the thing that motivates me to really delve into AI for healthcare is that, as I was trying to emphasize in the first part of the talk, nothing is settled right now. Nothing. The regulatory system, how you really make money on this, and who it benefits, and who kind of, how the data that is part of the training is selected, if we start from a place not of the kind of general large language models, but of something that's more specific and tailored, something for rare diseases, for example, right? So I do think it's possible in this setting that there may just be something that really pushes in a different direction in terms of how we value personal data. In the United States, usually the regulations, it seems like if you compare the US and the EU seems to protect individuals a lot more, and the US seems to protect corporations a lot more. And so as a broad generalization, that's not going to be something that's super easy to change, but it's also not completely fixed in place. So how the debates about regulation go forward is going to be extremely important. And one of the things about that is that they're not talking about AI for healthcare right now. They're just talking about AI. So the healthcare specific conversation needs to become part of this more than it has been so far. Yeah.
First, I want to thank you for this talk. It's been absolutely marvelous. I wish everyone in the country could hear this. I mean, honest to God.
Thank you.
I have this, you made, I think, a really, really, really strong argument for the importance of narrative medicine in the creation and the continuing development of these generative tools, especially, and what stood out the strongest for me was the medical record, that space, the narrative medical record. Because I've seen them, right, and we use them in the hospital a lot, and they're useless. I mean, the digital medical record as it stands now is largely unused because it is so very, very strange. And patients will say, well, I already told, you'll ask a patient a question and they'll say, well, I already told somebody this. And they say, do you people not write this down? They say, yeah, we do. And then, it's 75 pages back. And you also, I want to highlight again just how impressed I am. we talked earlier about the difficulty of measuring.
Yeah, right.
The Yelp story
Yes, I was
is
thinking
a
about that.
great
Yep.
answer,
Right,
that you
right.
can actually narrative medicine
Mhm.
as a tool
Mhm.
to measure what's important to patients that is in many ways superior to the tool they're using now, HCAPS, right?
Right.
So I think you've made such a very, very strong argument for the importance of narrative medicine moving forward on this.
Mm.
And we have at our university an awful lot of very, very strong advocates for that and a lot of people with experience. So I suppose the question is, what's the next step for them? Like, how clearly this is a great space,
Mhm.
right? Right now at the hospital system, there are people who would love help figuring out how to create a tool that could help them decipher the medical record in a way that was usable.
Yeah.
And the resources that we have here are exactly, I think you've made that argument, which is why I think everyone should hear it. Such a strong argument for the humanities as to be able to somehow do this. But you've also pointed out the people who are writing the code are not these people. So what, in your mind, what would be the next step for an institution like ours who has this strong medical humanities ability and a hospital system that is not integrated into that?
Yeah, right. So, so this would be a great project for the Health Humanities Lab. I mean, I really think so. You need to find your people in the health system. You need to find people who are primarily based in the healthcare system, clinicians, nurses, who are interested in spending some time working together with you on this, and just start working on it. Just try to find, I mean, you have to find the right collaborator, right? So you have to find someone who sees the problem, who gets enough about what the humanities can contribute, and maybe you have to present that to them so that they do get it. That they see this as an avenue for potential intervention, and then work on a specific defined project. So not just the whole thing, but like pick a department of the hospital, for example, and maybe pick a specific diagnosis or something to narrow it down just a little bit. And then, dig in, go to work, look at some unstructured text, talk together about where you could imagine it going, embrace a speculative and experimental approach initially, because first you have to get the partnerships and the kind of working together experience to be able to move forward in some way. Then you have to get people in who are the kind of tech people on this side of things. So, and I will tell you, I have a family member who is involved in clinical informatics and who periodically goes to get additional training or hear talks at the home campus of the medical record vendor that their hospital uses. And they've told me that, oftentimes in these big gatherings of thousands of people, that there will be talks, and a keynote talk will be about things like the patient narrative and the importance of the patient narrative, and how we need to do more to bring that to the fore. And here's how we're trying to do it. And here's how we're trying to do it. So at a certain high level, I think there's a recognition and an opening for this possibility. Not that many people really know how to do it, but if you can, I mean, of course, funding would help greatly to gather people together, to create the time and space to gather people together. But I do think, first you need a couple clinical partners, and then you need to bring in, you need to go to engineering or data science, like computer science or data science or somewhere in there, and get people there. And it may be that the best way to kind of find those partners is to reach out and offer to, host a small workshop or give a talk over lunch or something like that, to communicate, this is the idea. These are the kinds of questions and goals that we're looking to pursue, and just kind of, move sort of stepwise in that way. I mean, it's not easy, but it's also incredibly exciting and meaningful. And everyone in those fields also recognizes the problem. They recognize it from different vantage points and through different sort of lenses and terminology. But that's why I wanted to show those slides about, people saying like 80% of the record is, subjective and we don't know what to do with it. And natural language processing is advancing, but we still don't know what to do with it. And it's this huge bottleneck. So this is our domain. So yeah, let me know how it goes.